Hello, everybody, and welcome. My name is Debbie Holloway, and I'm the Community and Impact Coordinator here at the James Beard Foundation. And we're so excited that you've all decided to join us for another one of our industry support webinars, especially since COVID-19 has come to the United States. We've been doing many of these webinars weekly, sometimes many times a week, just to give as much industry support to the chefs, restaurant owners, and business owners in the food industry that are so greatly affected by this pandemic. Today, we have a really lovely webinar for you, and it is about Indigenous food economics. And we are doing this in partnership with A-dae Romero-Briones, who I will introduce in just a minute, from the First Nations Development Institute. Indigenous growers, gatherers, and eaters have managed their resources for a millennium, but these models are often overlooked in more modern food systems of food management, which recognize eaters as only consumers. So this webinar will explore Indigenous concepts around food management and connection and understanding of the relationships between each of us and our world through food. And A-dae and our esteemed panelists will talk more about that in just a moment. I'm going to quickly mute everyone except for me just for a minute so we don't get any feedback, and then I'll unmute you when I'm done. So A-dae is the Director of Programs for Native Food and Agriculture Program for the First Nations Development Institute. She is a dear friend of the James Beard Foundation. She's a Fulbright Scholar, a White House Champion of Change in Agriculture, as recognized by President Obama, and a founder and board member of several initiatives and institutes, such as the Aspen Institute's Rural Development Initiative. She has her JD from Arizona State University's College of Law and LLM in Food and Agricultural Law from the University of Arkansas. So I'm going to unmute everyone. A-dae, can I hand it over to you now? Thank you so much for being with us again.
Goetsi se hopa. Thank you, Debbie. Goetsi se hopa. I want to welcome everybody to this exciting webinar. We call it Indigenous Food Economics, even though I think that's a misnomer sometimes. We're just going to talk about Indigenous people, our foods, and how that shapes our worldview. I am so honored to have Kamuela and Enrique, but before we get into the meat and our introductions and our bios, we want to take some time to really ground everybody. We welcome you into this space. There's so many things going on in our lives, from fires to COVID to online schooling to transitions that are unlike anything that a lot of us have experienced in our lifetime. So I welcome you into this space. I welcome and I welcome you to open your mind and your heart to new information or even old information, to hear the words that come from the mouths of our panelists and the discussions, and really embrace those thoughts. It's a privilege that we get time during our day and in our lives to do this and to be with one another, especially through a computer. So I welcome that, and I welcome you into this space. And I'm going to turn it over to Kamuela to really ground us in the beginnings of our discussions today. Kamuela?
Mahalo, A-dae. I'm going to just open with a quick protocol, a chant that was taught to us by one of our revered thought leaders, elders. He is Kanahole, and the chant is the chant that was designed to create a ritual space of intention, to shock people out of the mundane and reground them in the present and the power of themselves, the people around them, the land under which they stand, and the future that they want to collectively bring forward. Na mèo na noel na mele e wome, e wome, e wome, e wome, gai ke mai na mai, o na mea na no eu, o na mele. E woman, e woman, e woman, e woman, gai ke mai na mai, o na mea na no eu, o na mele, e woman, e woman. Hey, woman. Mama, one. Mahalo, A-dae.
That, thank you for starting us off, Kamuela. Mahalo. And before we get started, I just want to say a few brief remarks about the folks that we have on the panel today. I am charged with doing their introductions, and I can definitely read from their bios, and I will, but I just wanted to make a few connections for our audience. First, at First Nations and me personally, I absolutely believe in the brilliance of indigeneity, and I think Kamuela and Enrique embody everything I think about when I think about the brilliance of Indigenous people. They're both grounded in their communities, grounded in the people they come from, grounded in the land that has raised them and influences their work, that is not only, I'm going to use the word prestigious and life-changing in the academic world for Indigenous people. It really brings a voice to some of the concepts that we talk about at our dinner tables with our grandmas or in the fields with our children. And so I think it's a privilege not only for me, but for our audience to be privy to those conversations and to hear some of the words that will come from their mouths today. And also, I welcome you to open your hearts and your minds and your thoughts to whatever flows from these conversations. And I welcome you to find Kamuela and Enrique and read their full bios because they're amazing people. And so I'll just keep my introduction to the bio brief, which is like Kamuela is from Waianae. He most people know him from Ma'o Farms, but now he is at the Office of Indigenous Innovation at the Office of Vice President for Research and Innovation at the University of Hawaiʻi. And before this position, he did much in the Waianae community. He's on several boards, but most know him throughout the country because he was a commissioner on the President Obama's White House initiative on Asian and Pacific Islanders. So welcome, Kamuela. Enrique is the director of American Indian Studies at CSU here in California. Most know him from his beautiful books about Indigenous food and Indigenous land. One is called Eating the Landscape, and it's probably one of my favorites because I use concepts from that book constantly in our work. That's where you can really learn about concentric ecology, and when I first heard the term. But he came out with a new book, and Enrique, do you mind holding that up so people can see, because it's beautiful. Irigara. He will correct my pronunciation. But Enrique is Raramuri, which is Tarahumara from Mexico, He received, of course, he has many academic accolades that you can read about on his bio. And so with that, I'm going to turn the mic over to Kamuela, who can start us off with, again, some opening remarks. We'll then pass the mic to Enrique, and then we'll just begin our open discussion about indigenous food, lands, people, and economics. Kamuela?
Mahalo, A-dae, and aloha, Enrique. I'm really glad to be sharing this with you, this space with you, and I want to thank the James Beard Foundation and the First Nations Development Fund for allowing us this platform. I just don't want to take up too much space in the starting. I just wanted to ground the conversation, especially for our viewers, that indigeneity is a word that is gaining more currency. And I think whenever things gain currency, there's always the potential for growth and for opportunities for people who have been marginalized. But there's always a shadow side. And there's also equally the potential to either commodify or fetish, I don't know how to say it, to make it a romanticized other, the noble savage kind of framework, where that's really great that they are doing these things, and we'll pat them on the back from afar. But I think the word indigenous to me is a really important one to unpack to start. And I think if indigeneity is basically the realm of the brown people, then it's going to be really underfunded and underutilized way to understand the world. I want to start with this idea of indigeneity refers to original peoples and the people that were there first. And the system's importance of why we talk about indigeneity is totally should be around equity and about current conversations about how we've treated each other over the years. I also think for me and the interest that I see, it's very practical. When you talk about indigenous people, you're talking about people that have lived in relationship with each other and their landscape for sometimes thousands of years. And that represents not just a space to pine for some of us, but a framework and a codex by which we can ground how we build forward, because that represents thousands of years of R&D and how to live within the carrying capacity of a place and how to work within the unit of a family to ensure that you can bequeath abundance to generations to follow. And if that's not what sustainability is asking, and that's not what a whole range is talking about, I think it's important that we acknowledge that it has to be understood equally from equity as well as from practical considerations. So I hope that we can continue to think about that. It's an invitation for participation. Everyone's indigenous to some place, and understanding that is what my father used to always say to me. But when you're in a place where indigenous people are, what is your responsibility to them to help them restore these systems for everyone's benefit? And if you're in the space you're indigenous to, what is your responsibility to reclaim those systems and bring them forth so you can bring stability first to you and your family, but then to everyone else around you? Because the times we're facing now require that type of collective thinking that is maybe beyond the contemporary canon that we're pulling from, and can pull into other ways of understanding the world that can help us collectively solve for the issues we're facing that, as A-dae put forward, are immense, complex, but they're all interrelated and they're all tied to our severing our relationship to the land. So thank you, A-dae. I hope that helps set the context for what we wanted to talk about. And I hope that my Oli in the chat invited people to enter and desumify their brains, because I know everyone's on web pages the entire time. The intention was to open a space of ritual for all of us to be in, and that when we close it, you have acknowledged that you're in a space where there were no observers, there were only participants, and you're asked to participate.
Thank you, Kamuela. And with that, before I turn it over to Enrique, there's a chat box, and we welcome everyone to participate. And we ask you to type in a few key pieces of information, where you're coming from, the lands that you may call home, and what intention you come into the room today. And Enrique, I pass it to you for some opening remarks.
Kuira ba, nehe raramuri, nehe taripame chomari. I would like to add on to a couple of things Kamuela brought up. But before that, when I was first thinking of the theme of this webinar, Indigenous Food Economics, like a lot of people, we go straight to the parts. The gathering, the processing of gathered foods, and then distribution, and all these other things that trading and seed saving. But if we can, all cultures around the world do this, but when I tried to bring it, center it on indigenous peoples, a couple of things stand out, and that's number one, like Kamuela suggested already, none of this matters unless we're doing it from a responsibility intention. I keep on bringing up when I teach, I teach American Indian Studies, and to my students, I keep bringing up this idea that I borrowed from the late Vine Deloria Jr. when he was talking about a comparison between indigenous cultures and European-based cultures. And he was suggesting that European-based cultures are rights-based, but native and indigenous cultures are responsibility-based. Everything we do is about our responsibility, depending on which nation we're from. Indigenous nation might be a responsibility to our clan. It could be our responsibility to our family, but there's always a responsibility to the land and to our future generations. These are all these things that color and influence our choices when it comes to food and gathering and cooking and growing. It influences our practices, the things we do on the land and with the land. The other thing I want to add on to what that Kamuela brought up was about how indigenous cultures, when it comes to our relationship to our landscapes and these places that we get our foods from, is that it's a practical relationship. And again, I'm reminded of another old colleague, Dennis Martinez, and he's a Pima. And we were talking once about this idea about sacred, native, people who are non-native are always thinking about native peoples, in this sort of romantic kind of atmosphere, and that everything's sacred that we do, even the way we comb our hair, it must be sacred somehow. But when it comes down to it, things that we do, especially on the land, is a result of 20, sometimes 100,000 years of being connected to a place. And over time, what we do on our landscapes is just practical knowledge. And Dennis and I were saying how, well, in most ways, practical knowledge works because we've always done it that way, done it for who knows how many hundreds of generations, and then it becomes sacred. So in a lot of ways, sacred knowledge is just practical knowledge, just stuff that works because it makes sense. Meaning, like I'm speaking from Chochenyo Ohlone country here in California, the Bay Area, but California was one of the most heavily populated areas before Europeans showed up, and there were always fires. But now these fires are catastrophic. The reason why is because we've stopped practically managing the landscapes here in California. People, the U.S. government, the California government don't let Native people go out anymore and gather materials for basket making. We're not allowed to go out and treat this landscape like a garden, which we've always done, not just here in California, but in Hawaii and all places where indigenous peoples have resided for centuries. And when we're allowed to do that, especially here in California, bringing it back to fire, we reduce the loads of fuels. We actually increase biodiversity, not just for ourselves, but all creatures. And we still have fires, but they're cooler fires. But not anymore. And so we need to get back to that. Those are my opening ideas. Anyway, we'll see what happens.
Well, thank you both. I think we are all here to talk about food and indigenous people in our landscape. So I'm just going to throw out the first question for both of you, and that is like, how do you think food connects all these things? We're talking about food, we're talking about obligations and responsibilities. And you know, indigenous people to me have some of the best food. Explain how food influences all these concepts that we're talking about today.
Enrique, you want to go first?
Well, you know, I'm thinking of, I was thinking of something I was just doing this morning. Okay, it's again here in California, because we're in the Bay Area, we can grow things year round. You know, so I was putting in my winter garden, and it occurred to me that everything I was planting was a result of seeds and starts that I got from friends and relatives. And I'm thinking about seed saving and the role of saving things that we've grown from previous seasons. And what does that mean? What kind of mentality and worldview does that imply? And it implies an idea that first, we're all part of, as indigenous peoples, and thinking about food, we're all part of this larger community. And when I mean community, I'm not talking about our human friends and relatives. For Native peoples, our community is everything around us that we're directly related to. It's not a romantic idea when my people, when we look at rain clouds, we're also, you know, we enter into this mental space that those clouds are me. I'm those clouds. When I'm planting a seed, that seed is me. I am those seeds. And we're directly related. It's all a direct relative, like our human aunts and uncles, and the words that we apply to these things reflect that. And seed saving is a further example of this larger sort of community that spans time and space. Because when we save seed, that means we're thinking generations ahead of us, but we're also connecting that to the previous generations. Is this ongoing sort of hybridization of indigenous peoples, this ongoing recreation of our relationship to our place. People think of indigenous peoples in this sort of static place that Hollywood reflects, but we're constantly changing. We're in this dynamic flux all the time. And we recognize that from simple things like saving seeds, but also the ceremonies that go around connected to saving seeds. Every time we conduct a ceremony, a ritual, we're recreating the universe. We're recreating the creation and our relationship to it. Over at Hopi, every February, there's the Poamu ceremonies, which are the bean sprout ceremonies. And so they actually, in the kivas, starting around middle of February, they start sprouting beans in the kivas. And so that's just this further reflection of what I was just talking about in our relationship to not just plants that are going to grow, but plants that are currently growing and plants, food plants that have grown in the past. Time is constantly overlapping. And whenever I'm thinking of foods, I'm thinking of those things. Kamuela, what do you think?
That's beautiful. I think a lot about in that question A-dae. A little bit of my background. So I was raised in a traditional. My father and his generation fought to restore land and to bring water back. So I'm his eldest son. So I was raised with a family that was actively restoring a traditional food system back before it was super cool or even understood. So there is a lot that was attached to that. Is really part of my formative memories of like watching them do that in that spaces where they were growing food, but then in my peers and my friends I grew up with, we were living in the conditions of what is now called American poverty. So I could see the interplay between my father and his peers reclaiming our ways we used to be, and then me living with my friends, myself having, some buffer from it because my parents, even though they were Native Hawaiian, I was raised in a predominantly Native Hawaiian community. My grandparents are really, really diligent and they own the land in which we live. So the poverty around me in my community, which was pretty robust, it wasn't especially as lived in for me in my daily life at home, or when I would go with my father into the mountains and they would restore traditional food systems. But going to public schools and being immersed in, I could see the effects of poverty really viscerally. And it stayed with me. And I think the one realization I had to start is that when I would go into the mountains, and despite what everyone was telling us back in the 80s and 70s about Hawaiians being lazy, savages, when we restored my father's generation restored the waterway and brought water back, the context of pre-contact Hawaiians were not only self-sufficient on the most far removed island on the face of the earth, we were self-sufficient in our own valleys, and that the entirety of our valley centralized and optimized for food production. So when you're that lived experience first of like watching the water flow through the systems and watching food grow and seeing it kind of the whole valley come alive when you brought water back to our ancestral ways of growing food, it really dawned on me first is like we were never poor. And when people are removed from the original context and then warehoused on lands that was not theirs and become second-class citizens in their own homes, you create a very specific dynamic called poverty. And if it happens for a couple of generations, then you think, oh, well, being Hawaiian is synonymous with being poor. And that's when you start racking up those really crappy socioeconomic indicators of poverty that end up everywhere. So I think the response is food is everything for people. It is our entirety. It is the bottom of our Laszlo pyramid. And a society that forgets that is a society that's teetering upon collapse. And I don't get too much more. You can see where I'm going with that. In Hawaiian, to feed was to rule, and the basis of our economic system was non-monetary. We didn't abstract wealth into coins. When the chiefs came to each valley that was expected to be self-sufficient, we would have rituals at the end of the year, which right around now, where the chief would come and the people would show them how much food we can produce and how fit they were. And that was tantamount to your year-end reporting to your chief when you got your contract renewed. And that whole that you get to try again, right? And you'd set forth your projected expectations for the next year, and then you get a chance to look at your projected versus your actuals and start to solve for the variance of the city together. So going to college after dropping out of high school helped me put English words of power to what our ancestors were doing. And I was like, hey, wait a minute. We had a triple bottom line economy for a long time. And we were doing all of these things, actually putting in grants as objectives and outcomes. Like Enrique was saying, there's hundreds, if not hundreds of thousands of years of R&D attached to this. And what the key thing I think is really vital to ask for any society is, what are you optimizing for? Society is optimized for things at the core, and then they pay PR firms to BS their way around what they want everybody to think they're actually optimizing for. I will put out that a GDP is a really poor thing to optimize for, because it doesn't encompass health of soil, health of people. And to me, recentering on what we're trying to do on those two metrics, with the output being food, as the measure of you are doing good by your community and you're doing good by the soil, is measured by the quality of the food you produce. And then that food feeds the metrics back again. So that production of food enriches the soil that sequesters carbon, and the production of food enriches the people, not just their BMIs, but viable economic development for them. That to me is what recentering on Indigenous thinking without romanticizing it looks like, because food is the indicator. And that goes beyond whatever is happening in our homesteads or our reservations. That is a basic human principle that many people are wrestling with, that allows indigeneity and people who carry those genealogies to participate in contemporary conversations outside of their spheres where they normally do, but begin to influence and shape global thinking. Because I think the current society we are does not optimize for these things. It optimizes for metrics that have gotten us to the space where we are, which kind of industrialization forces fracturing. It forces fracturing between people and land, people and family. And that is why indigeneity is romanticized, because people, regardless of who you are, often hunger for the authenticity of each other and authenticity of relationship with the land. When I worked at Ma'o Farms, which we have in the bio, which is a nonprofit social enterprise rooted in a Hawaiian community that grew organic products in our land again, and basically was a college internship, which allowed young adults from a really marginalized Native community to work on a farm in exchange for a full tuition waiver to college, and concurrently has grown to the largest organic farm on the urban island of Oahu, while sending hundreds of kids from our community college to not be farmers, to be leaders through food systems. What we found in that process of 11 years was there were a lot of people that wanted to back this because they saw themselves, and they saw themselves as indigenous. They didn't have the language to use it, and they didn't want to co-opt the term, and they didn't want to take it and run. But I think that recentering the question on what our society is optimizing for, and if we're optimizing for healthy food, then we'll get everything else right. So I work with a professor named Professor Albert Miles, and that's one of the things we started in the degree program at University of Hawaii West Oahu in sustainable food systems. Is when you get food right, you get everything else right. So thank you. I think it's a really great question.
Kamuela and Enrique, you touched on some pretty important points, and I'm just going to repeat: if we optimize for healthy food, we get everything else right. And you both come from essentially what the American society may call a food desert. What is your response to that? One, the Raramuri people are in the desert, right? Most people don't think food grows in the desert. Kamuela, you come from Waianae, which again you mentioned is considered an impoverished community. And so the natural American concept of food in these communities is absent. What is your response to folks who may think those things?
Well, you're kind of making a false comparison because when I think of food desert, I'm thinking of urban areas, and where people have to travel more than 1.5 miles just to get to a decent grocery store or something like that. When I think of just the word desert, however, I don't think of it as a negative thing. You know, my people traditionally aren't really from a desert. We're from the Sierra Madres of, you know, the high mountain region of Chihuahua, Mexico. And it's actually the third most biodiverse
Third
part or region
biodiverse
in the world.
world.
Um, and just yesterday, I was teaching one of my classes about um, the Sonoran Desert, you know, around Phoenix and Tucson, and it gets really hot there. But if you know what you're doing, it's you can live in that desert there. There's tons of edible plants and so on. It comes down to a matter of being part of an indigenous community who has co-evolved with the landscape. And one of the things I want people to go away from with here who haven't thought about this already is that when we're thinking about American Indians in this case and indigenous peoples in general, all native knowledge is local. It's, you know, it's unique to that culture's relationship to a specific landscape. And it could be, you know, a mountain region. It could be up in the Northeast. It could be over in the tropical region where Hawaii is, or it can be in a hot desert like in southern Arizona, but it doesn't matter. Is that native peoples all throughout around the world have figured out ways um, to I guess um, derive a relationship to that landscape and to make it work. And it only works if they figure out how to, and they've done this for centuries, you know, how to connect to that place and to learn its intricacies, its ins and outs, and so on. And that's part of what, you know, when I mentioned ceremony earlier, that's a part of what ceremony is about as well. We're honoring that constant connection to place. But going back to this notion of desert, then, and and getting food from it, and whether or not and how native knowledge is local, I want to reiterate how, for my people, um, I can move around in the Sierra Madres and I know exactly where I can get food from, how to make food grow, and what ceremonies and responsibilities are going to work for that. I would have a hard time doing that in Hawaii because I don't know what those plants are. I don't know what those seasons are like. I don't know what the climate's going to be doing. You know, maybe I can learn, but it would take some time, and vice versa for someone like Kamuela. Okay. And so native knowledge is not something that is all the same. People need to recognize that you know we have our specific relationships to our landscapes and our specific foods. Okay. Um, and I'm going to end there because I can, you know, I'll start making nonsensical talk here.
Kamuela, do you have?
You're
Oh,
muted.
muted. He's muted. You want to try now, Kamuela? Oh, okay, he's muted. He's still muted. Oh, there you go.
I think there's noise in the background. Um, yeah, I really appreciate all that Enrique says. It's like, you know, we have to disaggregate the word indigenous and native as being a lump sum. We're diverse. But really, I really understand why we need to be together and then disaggregate because we have been pushed to a periphery. I think what is the opportunity is I see when you're in a space that has been kind of removed from their practices to bring it back. And I think that's the beauty of it. It's a call to bring things back. And I think, man, you can do a lot of really great work where there's nothing there already, right? I think it really becomes a great space to start. If I can be a little raw, it's a framework we use a lot. And how do you turn bullshit into fertilizer? It's through good processing. So if there's a lot of bullshit in the place, if you figure out the right way to process it, man, you have some really fertile ground because you have all of the things there. You have will, you have outrage, and that is met with your ancestral systems. Well, you can light a fire and grow things, and you'll bring people behind you because I think humans are intrinsically good, and humans intrinsically want to work together to grow things. And that when that happens against that when systems come up against that, it actually bolsters us. I think for me, that's kind of how we saw it, is we go to the places where there is hurt and we grow from there. And that is how you actually have resilience be more than something you just write about in a grant, but you make resilience a practice. I think for us, how I would think a lot about it is to recapture and unpack our how we understand our framework, our ancestral systems to be tools to deploy in contemporary spaces. We use a lot, I've used a lot the word indigenize, and I use the word indigenize a lot in my thinking because it's a continuation of the word decolonize, which indigenization is a process our ancestors did, where they took the systems that were thrust upon them and treated them as vehicles for ancestral responsibilities. So Ma'o, for example, we didn't grow contemporary ancestral crops as much as we grew contemporary crops in an ancestral way. And we centered on our ancestors evaluated their efficacy of land, are the people fit, and is the landscape abundant. We shifted those metrics to our program to be what's the sales of products and the GPAs of students. And those are contemporary metrics of power. The goal of reclaiming our food system in a place that has been marginalized is to first and foremost restore agency and to restore our community back to decision-making capacity. And we have to use contemporary metrics to get to contemporary agency, but we can't do it in a way that by becoming successful in contemporary times, we become the them, that we become complicit. So we always understood the deeper level between the contemporary, under the contemporary metrics of sales and GPAs to be, is the soil healthy and is the student empowered? And is this young leader being put back into relationship with the soil to be, to articulate the future, what the future will look like for future generations? And that lay beneath the surface of what the farm and college operations presented. And that was exactly what the ancestors of the soil was doing there for hundreds of years. We just put a contemporary, casing on it, but the block underneath was still the same engine. And I think for me, understanding my language and going to college and learning my language was really important to then choose the right words in English. To talk about what our ancestors were doing, because I say when we say Indigenous or Hawaiian culture, they're terms that are dangerous because they're really emotional but poorly defined. And you can run a lot of cover under culture. And if you don't put these words, you can put a lot of bullshit in and do some bad things. So we wanted to be specific in definitions. So we held ourselves accountable first. So instead of Hawaiian culture, neither they're my Hawaiian words. We chose the right words in English: ancestral sciences and technologies of integrated biosystems management. Because the science talks about your academy and technology talks about industry, and that we want to not just reclaim growing food, but the mechanism from growing food to thrive in our contemporary society, to be true to our ancestral roots, but to forecast exactly what Enrique was saying, like we're not static people. And we are not people that are just trapped in a period of time. We're dynamic. And our dynamism is what's going to allow us to thrive and others to thrive because of us. And that is, to me, why start in the desert? Because that's the wrong word. I think we talk about, in our society, we have the lava fields, and we revere the deity that creates lava and that destroys land because her sister follows and puts new land and new growth in it. and we see ourselves as the trees, and we see ourselves as natural systems. So therefore, we respond to spaces of blight with that same type of intentionality of growing. Wow.
We heard some beautiful comments about intention and about the term indigenous, and also about how indigenous people interact. And so there's we have quite a few questions, but I want to open it up for both of you to give the audience a taste of or a recommendation on how to interact more with you and your work or your community. And just to mention how people can find you before we jump into questions. Kamuela?
Yeah, I was looking at the handle. That's the I have a new position at the University of Hawaii, so none of those are my handles. 808 Research. That's the handle of my office. I'm not on socials as much, but I think I can share my work email. I think that would be something that we can. I'll put it in the chat. Thank you.
And Enrique, how do people find you and how do people interact with you?
Well, I'm at California State University, East Bay, and if you go to our website and the ethnic studies department, there's my little bio and about 20-year-old outdated picture when I still had black hair. And then I'm not a social media person, but when I wrote my more recent book, Iwigara, they put together this Instagram page, and I think it's just Iwigara, and you can put some comments or questions there, I guess.
And so the audience knows, Enrique, what is Iwigara about?
Iwigara,
and when did it come out?
It came out a month ago. September 15th was the official date. It's essentially an ethnobotany of American Indians, but it's only 80 plants. I focused on, after talking to a lot of my native network of colleagues, narrowed down 80 of the most important plants for native peoples in what we call the United States. And that's I tell stories about the plants is really what it is. It's not just here's the name of a plant and what it's used for. I actually tried to give each plant a personality, because to native peoples, plants are alive. They are relatives. They are beings. And so I wanted to give them their stories as well.
Thank you for both. And again, the title is Iwigara, and it is by Enrique Salmón. And we have several questions from the audience that I'm going to throw at you in the last few minutes. We're not going to get through all of them because there are many. So if you have questions, please type them into the chat box and we'll get through as many as we can. The first question for either one of you: what might be a good resource book or learning about indigenous cuisine from your perspective?
For some reason, I always think about Lois Ellen Frank. She's a native chef. She lives over by Santa Fe, New Mexico, and she wrote one of my favorite books about native cuisines. And it's a cookbook, but she also includes a lot of cultural information. And I like the idea that she's trying to impart the notion that native foods are a form of a cuisine, just like French cuisine, Italian cuisine. There's indigenous cuisines as well, and they're all geographically located. So I would start there, and there's a bunch of others, but that's a good place.
Yeah. No, I would look at, there's some, from my perspective in Hawaii, there's some really stellar chefs, and they're very prolific, and they're always out and about. So Chef Ed Kenny, who's native Hawaiian, was a really great person. It's not just about indigenous food, but indigenous people using contemporary food, which is contemporary crops, which is also a really interesting conversation, because then you have to understand you can't unpack the food from the people, and I think the people and the landscape are one. So like that's a really good back and forth to really center the food systems on the people who are from that ancestry. I think if you research him, Edkeney, or another great chef that I work with is Mark Noguchi, who is also has done a lot of work in using indigenous crops to kind of create recipes, but to tell the stories around them. And some of the way we think about them, I think that they face chefs, and I think they really work heavily, and they're heavily involved in the culinary community.
Thank you, and we will add some of those resources into the chat so people can see the names and some of the titles. But there's more questions. So the point was made on the webinar that food is everything and we are disconnected. So how has this affected your communities during the pandemic?
On our end, I think it has both negative and positive outcomes. Negative in that, COVID is going to come into the richest communities first and stay in the poorest communities because of structural issues, access to healthy food and diet-related illnesses. It'll stick with them. So we have high incidences, and it's kind of stuck in our communities. But I think what the important part of it too was that the farming operations, their model just shot through the roof because of demand. So when for me is when we are subject to the system and we're just kind of waiting helpless for the system to fix us as Native people, we're kind of screwed. But if we take the system on and develop spaces that we are trying to reposition ourselves as producers, then actually it became a space for us to begin to reclaim agency. So that's how it's been playing out, at least from my perspective in our community, is our food producers who have had ability because of the folks that came before us that fought for the space for us to be in this kind of have these capacities, have been kind of thriving, and they've been seeing the increased demand for their product.
Yeah, I've been seeing an increase in an interest in our ancestral foods from Native peoples across the continent, to the point where people there are these sort of community gardens are sprouting up that weren't there before because of this growing interest. People recognizing, our food system is very fragile. This is something that people have been suddenly seeing because of the pandemic, and then realizing, we have to become more resilient when it comes to our foods. And that's the result has been this springing up of community gardens, people wanting to collect seeds, people trading seeds, people growing ancestral foods, people finding an interest in the foods that their ancestors ate 300 years ago. So I think it's, in the long run, it's going to be a good thing when it comes to indigenous foodways. And the side effect is going to be positive with regards to our individual health. I wouldn't be surprised if this continues, this connection to our ancestral foods, that we start to see a decrease in food-related illnesses like diabetes and cancer and heart disease. We'll see what happens, but it'd be great if we could eat more of these indigenous foods with higher fiber, lower fat, complex carbohydrates, and just turn this, this food-related uptick in disease that we've been seeing for the last few decades go in the other direction.
Yeah.
That's beautiful. That's yeah, I really like that comment. Okay, so we're coming to the end. We have many more questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of them. And we opened it up we opened our discussion with a pule, and in our final moments, I welcome both Enrique and Kamuela closing remarks, and then Kamuela, I'm hoping you can take us home.
I hope Enrique can give the last word, and I'll just do the puli out. My closing remarks is to thank all of you. I hope this was a space and time where you could step out of your contemporary existence and kind of just see to see things differently, and I hope that what was provided was useful. I call this work, to me, what is really important is the restoration of ancestral abundance, and that's what we're trying to do. Is we're trying to restore the abundance of our ancestors, and everyone has ancestors that have abundant stories. I hope this is something that can take root there. And I put my email in if people are really curious to follow up. And I really want to thank everybody that put where they were from, to see your names and where you're from cascading down the side. Made this a really powerful ritual space of intention. So thank you. And thank you, A-dae, and thank you, everyone at the James Beard Foundation for this time.
Mate taraba, adios, siba. And I just want to leave by having everyone just consider their responsibility to their larger community. And again, we're going beyond our human community, our plant and animal and insect and everything else community, and how everything we do, our choices, our practices impact that. And just keep that in mind with everything that you do as you move through life.
Kulikako e olu ala na kupuna na kua na koe apau e kia poai manao e olu ko i kai koe a mako me ko manao pono manao mana e ulu kumea ai kumea i loko ia aina e ka aina e kanaka apau ko honua ne mama uano.
Charago.
Mahalo, thank you. Thank you all for joining us. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you, A-dae. Thank you, Enrique and Kamuela. It was such an honor to have you with us on this webinar. And thank you to all of our guests for joining us. If you have any questions for the James Beard Foundation, or any questions you would like us to pass along to our guests, you can email impact@jamesbeard.org. And we hope to see you again for a future webinar. Goodbye, everybody.